Now, I want to welcome our moderator for the next panel on growth, Eric Singley, who heads up product at Yelp. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks.
I've known Eric for many years. He's been like an amazing supporter of Manifesto and of Products That Count and of Designers and Geeks. I want to welcome Sigal Bareket, who is the CEO of Taptica, one of the fastest growing mobile advertising companies. Welcome, Sigal. I met Sigal recently, and she's like one of the smartest person I know. And then Jeff Iacono from Square, heading up products there, who I met yesterday and was very impressed with. Welcome. All right, guys. Thank you.
Cool. Everyone can hear me okay? We're good? Great. That was a great talk, Andrew. Thank you. I learned a lot there. I do feel like, though, I would like to see that startup social for contagious diseases. I think that would be great. If anyone out there is looking for a great startup idea, I think it's a good place to start.
Please build that someday.
Cool. So I liked what you said earlier too. You said I think a lot of people when they think about growth, think about tactics and hacks. But that's probably not the right way to start. So let's talk about tactics and hacks. What can you guys all I'm just kidding. No tactics and hacks. We'll start instead about systems, right? Because I think that really resonated with me. Why don't you guys tell me a little bit about for each of you your teams, right? Like what does growth look like in your organization? So maybe folks out there that are looking to just get better at growth or get better at that team. What does that look like for each of you?
Is on? So I'm Jeff from Square. I'm going to talk a little bit about like early on Square. I'm on the product side of Caviar right now, which is this food delivery company that was acquired by Square. But thinking back to what does growth look like for Square back like 3-4 years ago, the big thing that was really like kind of groundbreaking that comes to my mind is just the different channels that we pursued and how we pursued those. So we obviously had a lot of these digital components to it, but the thing that we really looked into pretty deeply was the retail channel. And this seems like pretty basic now, but at that point in time, it was kind of crazy. Like we started off by putting our readers in the Apple Store and then thinking through like who are we competing with in that store. And at that point in time, it wasn't different readers, it was just all of the different accessories that were out there. And that was kind of that system level broad stroke of this is a great new channel for us to reach people. And it helped us expand into other areas like Best Buy, Staples, things like that. And one of the really amazing ones was Home Depot, where you think through from that really high level, who are the folks that are going to end up using this product and how can we reach them? So we ended up going in the Home Depot. You have a ton of builders and contractors that are there. And we ended up sticking our readers right near the kind of invoice station. So you could bill someone later or you could get paid right now. So I think that was the really like innovative thing that comes to my mind is thinking through from that high level, what are those different areas that we can go into that other folks aren't? And then does that move us up into the right directionally? And then how do we have an underpinning from the underside from an analytics standpoint to know if this is worth our investment and our time. I spent some time on the BI team, and that was a huge component of what we did was making sure that we were paying to get these out into retail channels. It was actually worth our while, so that was like a really big thing that we focused on.
Cool. I'll just jump off that just for a second because I think one thing I like that you mentioned there is you did a lot of growth work that was offline. I think a lot of us come from digital backgrounds, and so that's what we gravitate towards because it's easy to experiment there, and you've got a bunch of engineers you're working with. But in the early days of Yelp, we're talking way back in 2006. But growth for us was just about hustle, right? Throwing parties for those 3 people in a city that were writing reviews and getting them excited about writing more reviews. So it was really person to person, city to city, and then after that, then you can put in some of these, larger kind of digital experimental systems. But early on, it was really kind of
your technique sounds a lot more fun than ours.
Handshakes and free drinks. That was our growth model at the start.
Yeah.
But I think we often forget about some of those, like sneaker-based hustling kind of channels that, especially when you're just getting started, and you talked about trying to find channels for brand new apps, maybe that's actually a place to start.
Well, and I do think one interesting thing that both Square, Yelp, and Uber, all share is that fundamentally they're all, different flavors of local marketplaces, right? You need the content creators, and then you need the consumers for Yelp. For Uber, obviously, drivers and riders. And so I think one of the things that ends up happening is inevitably, like, it is kind of a grind. It is a local kind of, grind because, you have to replicate this model, in city after city after city. And so the versions where there's like so much offline work, I mean, obviously Uber does like a ton of that as well. There's city teams, there's, several hundred city teams on the ground all over the world that are, doing this type of work for the same reason.
And it's messy, right? I think people forget about the messiness of that type of growth, right?
That's right. Yeah, no, it's something where, like, if you come from a purely software background, you would not be excited to, try to solve problems with, like, sending more humans into, like, the city that's, like, thousands of miles away to try to grow it,
Right.
But that's what you need for these local marketplaces.
Right. Any other thoughts on that for either of you? Kind of either offline growth or kind of growing your growth team at the beginning, or how that worked for you?
I have a slightly different perspective because I'm coming from a marketing company, and instead of just seeing one company in very, like, to the depth, we have seen, I would say, 10,000 campaigns running in our system, starting from the gaming companies 4 or 5 years ago. Now, I think that the most recent and exciting thing is Starbucks starting to get into more performance-based user acquisition. And throughout all these categories and companies that we've seen throughout the years, the main thing we kept asking and trying to just push the marketing teams into finding first finding the KPIs. What is the single most important thing that you're looking for? Whether it's like booking the first ride in the first session, or ordering the first food in Caviar in the first session, or having a user coming in the second and third day because you're just growing your app and you just want them to come back again and again. What is the single most important thing? Let's just find it first and then start scaling. Once we know what the KPI is, this is when we can start selling and growing, and we will have some exciting examples maybe later in the session, but that's like the main strategy, and it's just kind of amazing how an industry by industry, from the gaming to commerce to travel to QSR now, just going in, more and more companies are starting to understand that importance of just the one single parameter and then scaling from there.
Right.
From a venture capital point of view, I'll tell you what I'm looking for. Ultimately, out of a user, there's only 3 things you want. You either want their data, which is really a reflection of their behavior in real time, ideally. Second, you want their attention. But actually, attention is more of a sign of their self-expression, their storytelling. What are they trying to say? Which is about identity. And third is their spend, their money. And so depending on the kind of business you're building, I want to see the growth in any of those 3 categories. But I'm actually even more interested in the unit economic model of one user. If there's signs that you're turning that individual user into a habitual user, I can solve new user acquisition by pouring tons of money on it. I cannot solve a leaky bucket. If you show me signs that you only have 100 users, but 50 of them are turning into habitual users by cohort, by retention or whatever, I will back you far more than you got featured in BuzzFeed and you got 1 million installs and they shark finned and your D7 is at 17%.
Tim, I think that's good. Can you get a little more specific there? What are some of those things that you might look for when you're looking for, hey, are people having that kind of success?
Absolutely. I think of the engagement funnel, not necessarily conversion funnel, but engagement funnel. And you've got traditional stats like download to reg, reg to MAU, MAU to WAU, and then DAU. But I'm actually looking for signs that people are trying to self-express in it. What I mean by that is I think the heart of everything is people want to tell their story. They just want to be, kind of recognized for who they are. If the product or service or purchase allows them to tell a little bit about who they are, it's like a personal branding event, if you will. It's like when you put that review in Yelp, what are you really looking for? You're looking for likes, funny, useful, etc. A failed review is one that got no attention. So that would be one engagement loop, is that I've got this self-expression thing and I'm looking for anyone else out there who resonates with me. I got that, boom. That's like the start of that. So I think a lot about this sort of personal storytelling loop. When I make that first purchase, it's cool, but if I didn't brag about it or I didn't get a high five or something from, that was just sort of just a utility solo purchase. It wasn't kind of like a socially relevant purchase. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's great. So let's kind of come back to, again, like your company, maybe you're either just getting started or you've kind of found that initial kind of product fit. So maybe anything that you guys have all seen, how have you seen companies grow growth teams, right? How have you accelerated growth just by putting in place a better system or changing a process or a key hire, some way you've just kind of poured some fuel on the growth machine.
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the things that I've seen as startups kind of transition into this quantitative mode, I think the first thing is getting sort of your data and your analytics, sort of in order. Like, what are your KPIs? What are you actually thinking about? Actually instrumenting, all the different flows. Typically, the highest value, easiest things to do tend to be in the obvious funnels in your business. So your sign-up funnel, your checkout funnel, some of these things. And like in a lot of cases, this is where like the common design patterns and tips and tricks actually do really matter, where you're like, oh yeah, if you're in a checkout flow, if you're in a sign-up flow, you probably don't want like a bunch of navigation links all over the place that take people away, from checking out. And building that. But I think eventually you get to a point where you've mostly been focusing on reducing friction, and you start to hit diminishing returns. And at that point, then you're starting to think more deeply about, product functionality, what are new, like, pretty deep product initiatives that might actually contribute to growth. And I think that's one of the reasons why if you talk to the Facebook growth team, it's super fascinating that like Messenger reports into the growth team, internet.org reports to the growth team, because these are like really long-term growth initiatives, and they can think long-term like that, versus, for the typical startup, you're just trying to like run as many A/B tests as you can to reduce friction.
My word here would be granularity. We've seen companies, very specific gaming company, who has 14 people working on just promoting one game. I'm sorry. And every one of them knows every moving part in the whole equation, from a banner to a message to target audience to a city, and just plays with each of every parameters in the equation, finding the one who just gets into another pocket of more users. Just to give you I'm thinking very granular example, maybe too granular, as one of these team members told me, so we realized that we want more people to use our games, but if we are presenting our banner ad on a casual game, and we are not a casual game, these users are not converting to actually be playing with our games. So we want our banner to be presented to a user in a casual game only in the 101 hour of this user actually playing the game, which is, I don't think there could be any more like granular than that. The 101 hour of playing a game, this is when he sees an ad. So this is, when we get there, you're being too granular, but everything before that, that's like a very good growth team.
I agreed wholeheartedly with Andrew. I think like one of the biggest things that you have to get right is your data story. If you can't measure anything, you can't manage it. And the other side of it, and you mentioned this while you were speaking individually, is those KPIs. Like you can just kind of latch on to KPIs and say like, oh, or that's that business, like that sounds cool, let's do that. I think you really have to take the time to think through like what moves your business and what experience do you want your customers to have. And then make sure that getting them from wherever they're starting at to that end point is highly instrumented, so you can measure and see how effective you're being just on the baseline. But then also, as you move into that, well, great, that's working, how do you start to optimize that? And if you don't have the right data story, you're just going to be kind of hopelessly lost, or just kind of like chopping in the dark. This might not be exactly what the question you're asking as well, but from like a structural standpoint, Square's kind of gone through this flip-flop back and forth of having their own growth team that was independent. You kind of inject into other teams here and there. There are some pros and cons to that, and then we've kind of split that up where you go into the dedicated model where you're sitting with actual product teams. So I've seen both sides of it. Personally, I kind of like the hybrid model where you're deeply entrenched with a team. You really understand what they're trying to do, and you're really trying to provide information and guidance around. If you're the PM or an analyst or whomever you may be, if you're a PM, hopefully you're going for growth. If you're an analyst, hopefully you're trying to give the PM information so they can go for growth. But I think being embedded with the team is hugely beneficial. But having that overall like growth team community where you can share best practices or things of that nature is really beneficial within an organization.
Yeah, I think it's great, and that was exactly what I was asking earlier. I think one of the things we learned when we first started doing growth at Yelp was we hired a growth product manager. He might be in the audience here today. Poor guy at the beginning, he had no engineers to work with at all, and so
set up for success.
Yeah, we did great there, but so he did kind of what he could. But then I think it wasn't until we did a few things. Of course, we built a proper growth team as opposed to having to kind of cobble together resources from other teams, and then he figured out what that model was for Yelp. What are those granular metrics that you need to be measuring? And then putting systems in place to measure them well and quickly, and kind of building all the plumbing to be able to do experimentation quickly, to do analysis quickly, all these things. It's, in order to do growth, you have to have some element of speed, and the things that you're measuring have to be easy to measure. And that just frankly took a lot of time. And I personally underestimated that amount of time that takes, right? Just to kind of set up that growth infrastructure. That probably took us a year to get to the point where we felt like there was a real machine there. I thought that I kind of took for granted that we could just do that very easily.
Because basically, you can't have a growth team without an analytics team, right?
Yeah.
You have to be able to analyze something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm an old control systems engineer major, and there was this one saying that you cannot control that which you do not observe, which is exactly what you said. If you don't measure it, you can't control it. But so the extreme response, the gaming people did this, they would instrument every single pixel on the whole thing. So they were flooded with lots of signals, and then the next game was which signals matter out of the thousands of those. Then it was about defining the KPIs. But you know what I found, and you said this earlier, you tend to define KPIs by like what you think other people are doing, but sometimes you need to revisit which KPIs actually matter every quarter maybe, because you only optimize the things that you pay attention to. And so like 5 KPIs that start off initially important might not be the right ones 6 months later.
Yep. Yeah, we do that at Square every quarter. We revisit we don't try to aggressively change our roadmap, but we at least market to market. And one of the main things we do is we say, are we thinking about our business in the right way? Are we measuring the right things and going after them? With us, we've become a pretty big company, not as big as Uber yet, but you have to have this kind of scoreboard that we're all going after, and if you're not constantly rethinking that and refreshing it, you can get pretty stale in terms of like what you're pursuing. So I think it's super healthy to like take that step back and be introspective and say, what are we doing and what's going to help us like win the day? And then you think through what is that metric that we're going after, and then you get alignment from everybody, not only within your team, but if you're dealing with a big organization, then it's great because then you get coordination. So.
Yeah, maybe I'll add one other little thing about the sort of team structure thing. At Facebook and Uber, one of the most common one of the configurations that you can go for is sort of a standalone product unit that is reporting to the CEO, and there's a VP of growth, and you actually have analytics and international, and a couple other things reporting into growth. And so that's one common configuration. The other configuration that seems to work quite well is you do have like a VP product, somebody who's running product, and then one of the folks that's reporting to them just as a PM is sort of like a director PM of growth. And both model, LinkedIn has more of the has a head of product, and then a growth team that reports into the product team. Dropbox has that as well. Versus Facebook and Uber have like the standalone thing. But one of the first things that these teams always end up cleaning up is the analytics. That's like kind of you just have to do that.
So just add some examples about questioning your KPIs and re-examining them. Just 2 examples of 2 companies who were doing great with this. So one, again, is a gaming company, started to question their audience. So traditionally, it was hardcore games, shooting games. Of course, who shoots animals? Men, right? Women will never do such a thing. But then they're saying, maybe we just need to test it, just add some banners or just target women in maybe specific areas that may be interested in it. And they realize that women are spending just as much as men in their game. So this is another audience they found by questioning the KPIs. The same thing with the VOD app we had a chance to work with. So as usual, as everybody's doing, they were targeting millennials because that's the hype thing to do, target millennials. But these guys have like content for 40 plus, 50 plus people. And they realize maybe if we just put the content on the front and start to send messages for people who have iPads, or maybe communicating with their grandkids or something, and they have the money, why won't we just talk to them and see if they're another audience instead of just going after the millennials where everybody's going after them? 33% increase in revenues just by adding another target audience and trying to reach out behind the usual KPIs.
Cool. Andrew, I want to come back to something that you said a little bit, and I know we said we weren't going to talk about tactics, but I thought this was kind of an interesting area of, especially for apps. I mean, I don't know how obvious it is at this point. You sort of mentioned how the kind of doing app growth for especially a new app is difficult just given the limited channels, right?
Definitely.
Essentially, you've got the App Store and you've got the Play Store, and then you have ways to drive people to that. But I guess Yelp isn't in this category, being where we've been around for a while. But what kind of guidance do you give folks? You're starting out. Where are even places to kind of to look, right? That are beyond the big dog channels of the App
great.
Stores.
Yeah,
Where do you
definitely.
start?
Yeah, so I mean, I do think that I'm going to answer this tactical question in a systemic way. So, so I do think that one of the really great things when you're small is that you can go after channels that that are less competitive. Because of the fact that they suit your product, and when you get for example like a product hunt, or you get like a blog to write about you, or you get you go on Reddit and you're super active with your users there, potential users there, that's all legwork that of course doesn't scale, but is awesome in the early days as you're primarily just trying to figure out product market fit. Yep. And so what I typically find is that with these startups is you start out with these really limited channels, takes lots of legwork. You're refining your product, it's getting better and better, and then you end up moving channels because you figure out hey, it turns out the 5th announcement that I did on Reddit for this really narrow subreddit that targets people with contagious diseases, is no longer effective, and so now I have to go find the next thing, and then ideally you end up finding bigger and bigger channels and sort of building your portfolio of a bunch of distribution. And I think, you really can't overlook, of course, especially in the app world, just word of mouth. What I find is that when you have really super great, when you have amazing product market fit, and one of the most frustrating things, for example, looking at Uber's data or looking at Dropbox's data, two companies where I've seen really deeply into their growth teams, is that you get it's on one hand it's an amazing thing, on one hand very frustrating, is that you get so much organic traffic, a ton of organic traffic, and you're just where is this coming from? How do I get more? How do I optimize this? But really, it's just because the product is amazing, mm-hmm. right? And so I think you can't overlook how important that is, and then of course then you try to optimize everything else. But organic is organic.
Yep. And don't forget we have to create a great product before we can grow that product, right? Yeah, you can't skip that step. That's an important.
That's right. Yeah, I mean one way to view one way that I've described it is that. It's sort of a big magnifying, growth and all these tactics and techniques and everything. It's a big magnifying glass on whatever you have, right? And so if you're lucky, you have a small diamond and you put a magnifying glass on it, you end up with a big diamond, right? Yeah. On the other hand, if you have a small piece of shit, and you put them anyway, yeah, you get the point, right? And I think that's basically what we saw in the Facebook era, and what we saw in a bunch of these sort of shark fin type companies, is that they put a lot of effort on growth. They pumped a bunch of money into it, paid acquisition, et cetera. But in the end, these became larger, shittier companies. So we don't want that.
Just gonna don't shine a big light on small pieces of shit. I'm just gonna write that down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, write that down. Everyone, write that down, please.
Tweet that now. Cool. I think that's great. Well, I'm gonna segue a little bit, kind of in the next part of the conference here, and talk about sort of designing for growth. You talked a little bit about this, Andrew, and I know we've got a lot of designers here today. So one of the things I know can be tricky, especially if you've got an organization that cares a lot about design, is how do these teams interact? You've got PMs and analysts are trying to drive to a metric, and you've got designers that are kind of trying to mine the store a little bit more holistically. How have you guys seen examples of how do you get these folks to work well together and have them both be happy with what they're delivering?
I would say design has to be integrated from the start. Do not take design as a bolt-on and ask them to put Chrome on your crappy product. That never works. Part of that though, the management team has to know how to hire for designers and actually how to write the job spec. A lot of folks say, I need a designer, but it's an afterthought. Please do not make that the case. Build them into your product organizations, because they really need that input from the start.
Maybe some example of how design could be really changing in terms of growth. So in many of the categories we have been working with, whether it's dating or commerce or even real estate, there are these people who are, when they're seeing an ad, they're looking for the one perfect thing. The one perfect house, the one perfect man, hopefully both of them at the same time if you can, or whatever, the one perfect thing to buy, while others want to get into a situation when there is a variety. I don't want if I want one perfect house, but I want to see that there is a lot here, and at least their prices make sense. The same with commerce, for sure the same with dating. So we've seen companies going and saying, we don't know who is going to get which design, which message, which banner will work for which of our audience. Let's just try both of them. Have one set of banners going mainly on variety, and we have a lot. I'm sure we can find something here, come and get our app. Or we have the just one perfect thing that you're looking, come and get it. And within this, start to experiment with audiences. So we are going to send this message to women or men, see which one reacts better. We're going to send this message to people in San Francisco. It's very surprising that people in San Francisco, people in New York, and people in Oregon have very different kind of behavior. And it's just per city, that just like you have age and gender, location is a very specific thing in terms of behavior. So if you can take these messages and try them with different audiences, again, going back to the granularity I mentioned before, you find just the right message, just the right person, and with a small tweak of the design, you get a huge growth.
It sounds like try and find, you have to get this granularity, you have to segment your audience enough so a designer knows who they're designing for, and then they can optimize.
And the fun part is that you don't need to choose. I mean, the cost of experimenting here is like $500. So just you run it on Facebook, you see how it goes, you tweak it, you go on. So you don't need to take, it's like not a TV campaign. If I'm missing the point here, I spent $5 million. You just try different things, different tweaks, a very quick response on this works. Let's continue with this. Let's get rid of the others. Let's continue on.
Yeah, so with Square has a very strong design aesthetic, and just some of the best designers I've had the privilege of working with. The thing that I would say there, though, is it's always a collaboration. All of the designers that we have in-house, they have that a great mindset of we want this to be an amazing product, and it needs to look great. You need to feel awesome when you're using it. But at the same time, there's that level of practicality of like, we're a business and we need to do certain things or test them. So there will be times where from a product standpoint, like you have a disagreement. I think at the end of the day, it's just ensuring that the product side and the design side can work very hand in hand and understands, what's the end goal that we're going for here. The other side of it also, though, is the data thing we were talking about before, where an A/B test is a great way to settle an argument. So, and you don't have to like yell at each other. So, ensuring that you have that properly instrumented and then can like agree on what you're going for. That's where you don't really have to like get in each other's face too much. Which is
great. And to add on to the A/B testing, I think day to day, one of the most common kinds of conflicts that I see is sort of the desire for designers to want to optimize for the global, right, around consistency, around experience, things that may be like actually pretty hard to quantify, versus sort of the PM desire to ship as many A/B tests as possible and try to find all of these like 10% like quick hits. And how do you sort of match the global and the local in a way where everyone's still happy? And I think there's a couple solutions that, and I think the Uber team has a bunch of very talented growth designers that have sort of been able to bring this together. Is that you really need you need mutual respect, right? You need the the PMs who are running the growth projects to really embrace like that there are style guidelines, there are like there is a minimum requirement for what you're able to deliver, and then at the same time to have the growth designers really embrace KPIs and understand that the team fundamentally, the growth team fundamentally, the output is increasing these KPIs and have respect for that as well. And so I think organizationally one of the ways that has worked in the sort of business unit type structure is you have the designers report into the growth team. Right? Rather than having it be this sort of cross-functional thing. And then when you're actually hiring designers and sort of the day-to-day practices that you actually try and facilitate and really select for folks who want to work at the pace that the growth team wants to work at, which hopefully should be much, much, much faster than the core experience teams. And so because of that, you're able to get a slightly kind of different DNA, and I think that's great for the people where they can really embrace that and they want to see the quantitative impact that their designs are making versus kind of the more like the more qualitative stuff.
Yeah, that's great. It just summarize that a little bit. Sounds like there's a hiring component here, but it's also kind of organizational. The fact that you called the folks growth designers, I think, is telling, right? It's like, hey, your job as a designer is growth, right? But also having that respect for, hey, there is a style guide, or at least hopefully there's a style guide, and PMs need to know that exists and kind of work within those constraints. I think that makes a lot of sense. Cool. So switching gears again a little bit, a lot of folks, we still live in a world where the web exists and mobile exists, and one I think challenge Yelp faces, other companies face, is how do you measure growth in this kind of multi-channel universe that we live in, right? And measure across channels. Any experience that you all have had doing that effectively that you can talk about?
I think that's, it's a process. It's a long process. It will take time, and I think that some of the companies are waiting for the ultimate solution. For all channels have the same identifier, then you can measure users across all channels, and we might get there. It will take time, but I like the companies who are being bold enough to say, even though technology is not 100% supporting right now with cross-channel measurement, I'll try to do whatever I can with the channels that I have. One company that we've seen doing a very good job is running a TV campaign, at the same time running the same campaign on mobile with the same message exactly. And we know that you can't measure TV, but we can measure what's happening in mobile. And they were seeing 400% increase in the performance in the campaign on mobile at the same time, meaning half of CPI double the effectiveness. And a week after the TV campaign was gone up, the mobile campaign went down too. So it's true that we don't actually know what happened in the mobile, but we think in the TV, but we think that what happened is people were just exposed to the message, they've seen it, and then exposed to exactly the same message in mobile at the same time, and it made the tweak, it made the change, and they can definitely say that the TV ad contributed to people actually using or downloading the app and actually using it because they were exposed to a very good message on the TV.
One of my favorite companies, Lumosity, I'd done early on, they were a really good example of tweaking the user experience across platforms. And what they found is different engagements on different screens work well. You might have somebody discover your app because they saw a TV ad, they download it, but then you steer them to the web where they can do deeper research, and then go back to mobile for sort of the snack-based messaging or alerting, but then you re-engage them through email for a deeper personal dashboard. So that system of designing all these behaviors across the screens, I found the best services are never one size fits all. It's that there's different types of engagement for different screens. Mm-hmm. So in general, deeper research, deeper browsing, probably done on larger screens. If it's the snack size messaging, social, liking this, that sort of the repeat frequency stuff, those are good on the mobile screens. Maybe notifications that even shift towards wearables and whatnot. But then re-engagement, the personalized newsletter, email is still very powerful for that too.
Yeah, it's great. One thing you talked about earlier, Andrew, also was looking at the entire system for acquisition all the way through retention. One of the things that Yelp has looked at is in that system, how do people shift in and out of platforms over time? So one behavior that we've seen from the beginning of mobile is that mobile traffic spikes on the weekends and dips during the week, and then the web is the opposite. So when we're thinking about retention, we can target people at different times of the week. So Mondays at noon tends to be key procrastination time, so that's a good time to hit people with, hey, maybe you should write a review right now because you don't want to do your work. So it's kind of knowing what platforms people are on at different times, and then what part of the funnel are you in. We're not really in like an acquisition mode there, we're more kind of in a retention mode.
We, just to relay a like experience, so at Square we dove into a bunch of our data and saw where are those key things that keep one of our customers retained, like what are the core features that they're using. There's a series of them, but we said, all right, well, what's a technique or a tactic that we can use to get or introduce these features at the appropriate time? When do we see those biggest points of drop-off? Because we didn't want to annoy our customers by being like, hey, use this thing. And they're like, yeah, we're going to use it. Like, chill out. But so we wanted to figure out like when are those appropriate times to try to interject and say like, hey, there's this thing that exists. You should try it out. And going back to what you were talking about earlier, the tactic there was we ended up doing various things like checklists, stuff like that, through email campaigns that were timed, but just applying the right kind of like core growth hack thing or starting with something, it wouldn't have landed if we hadn't taken the time to think through what are we actually trying to go for and when is it most appropriate. So I think like the long story short is think about that overall system, but then also like that's where you can start to apply those specific items that you read about on Hacker News and Twitter.
All right, cool. We've just got about 5 minutes or so left, so I want to give you guys a chance to ask some questions to our awesome panelists here. So anyone want to be the brave first person to ask a question? I'll repeat it so everybody can hear. Anyone? Any hands? We had perfect information, no questions. Way in the back there, yeah. Yeah, you. I don't think we have mics, so yeah, I'll repeat. Just yeah, shout it. So I'll just repeat real quick. So I think I got it right. So Andrew was talking earlier about pace, and pace, like maybe designers and engineers are sort of working at a different pace. Does that create maybe a bottleneck, and how do you maybe manage that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think the biggest part there, and part of why I was talking about the style guide is is the sense that if you don't have some standards for how to put together even like basic like landing pages and basic variations, you're not going to be able to scale that as you're trying to build like many A/B test variations, many simple like kind of little funnel shifts and like things that you're trying to do. And having like a small group of designers like try to make each one of those perfect at the same pace that like they might work on like a core experience, right? And so I think because of that, you just have to think differently and think more intelligently about the fact that like, hey, if I'm going to have to design all these A/B test variations, and frankly, probably most of them, aren't going to work. Like historically, when I dig into A/B tests, like about let's say 25 to 30% of them will actually close as test, right? And the vast majority of them close as control, right? So then, do you really want to put that much effort and that much thinking into something that you're probably going to throw away, right? And so I think once you kind of like confront the reality of that, then I think everybody has to work together to figure out how to scale design in a way where it doesn't become like, the really big bottleneck. And I rarely meet designers that don't feel like, in a company, whether or not they have an official growth team or not, but certainly prior to Uber and thinking about like startups that I've worked with or sort of encountered, the designers always feel like they're sort of in a very like rushed state because they're not able to make every A/B test variation as amazing as they totally would like to. But the whole point is to make these A/B tests so cheap that anybody can do it, that it's a very democratic kind of process. If you have a great idea, you can like kind of throw it out there. And of course, like once it's actually done and if it moves the metrics, like you can always go back and like clean it up, right? But I think that sort of requires a shift in thinking that trying to reduce the cost of the A/B tests and sort of being able to run a bunch of them and having this sort of compounding growth rate where if you every month you can find a couple 10% increases in your funnel, then over time, that's such a huge, such a huge competitive advantage.
Yeah, that's great. Cool. Time for maybe one or two more questions. Anyone else? Yes, standing up way in the back. Yeah.
I think that's super important because
I'll just repeat the question real fast. So kind of this multi-channel question again, is it important to figure out, hey, a user who we saw 5 weeks ago on email, and then do we see them again yesterday on mobile? Is it important to get that kind of resolution?
Totally. If you can track all that, you can truly understand what the conversion rates really are. Because there's a lot of times there's this notion of a nurture campaign might take talking to that user seasonally, over many emails before they convert. You might have gotten their email though because they downloaded the free app. They might never engage with that free app for a long time, but you've got their email. That's basically a chance to chat with them and talk to them. And it might be a service that they don't think about till, say, next bikini season or whatever it is. And so we see a lot of those with services where you're just trying to stay top of mind quarterly. Your key goal is get that unique identifier, whether it's phone number or email, that you can track across multiple platforms.
I think that the official numbers are 6 to 8 touch points with the
yep.
user before you can actually have him as a customer.
Okay, 6 to 8 touch points before you maybe see engagement, or yeah, it's great. Okay, last question. Yeah, right here.
A growth strategy different for consumer products and enterprise products, and where do you get your ideas for growth features?
Two big questions there. So is kind of our growth strategies different in the enterprise versus on consumer products, and then kind of where do you get new ideas for kind of things to test? So we'll start with the first, enterprise versus consumer.
Yeah. Well, I think on consumer enterprise, it's so different, right? I think in consumer, because you get much more around virality. That's like one of the key, like really key things, is you get a lot more virality. And I think that's why like consumerized, like the consumerization of enterprise and like Dropbox and Slack and these companies are so powerful, is because they're able to use sort of like consumer methods, but inside an enterprise, and using platforms like Active Directory, where almost everybody's been doing import your address book in consumer, but being able to actually like start thinking about like the Microsoft stack and how do you integrate into that, like becomes really interesting. The other way, of course, within enterprise that you're seeing so much of is like content marketing, right? And like when you think about what is content marketing, well, it's really like you're attaching something that's easily shareable, that's kind of like viral, and maybe sort of promotes your product, but not really, right? And sort of like gluing them together, and then using content marketing and sort of the new platform of like Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, like everything added together to propagate this free content, and then building a funnel, and nurture campaigns and all that stuff in order to do that. So I think that there are like a lot of interesting lessons, that are driven by like, sort of these consumer ideas. On the second part, I think, no matter what you end up doing, as far as like getting new ideas, the best place to start, I think, is you look at some of the companies that have developed, that have real growth teams, that they do a ton of A/B testing, and I just actually try to use their products, and I try to invite people all the time, and I try to like just stay up to date on, what these guys are doing, because they're the folks that are professionally like figuring it out. So I guess maybe the short answer to that is like, you start by copying other people. It's a very fancy way to say you copy people, and then you try variations of your own that fit your business. So
I think that's great.
I got a great playbook for you in enterprise. It's either top down or it's bottoms up, and it's either new behavior or it's either simplify existing workflow. And what I mean by that is, if it's top down, you're probably selling to a business head who has some business problem. They need some new system, whether it's a CRM or whatever. They're going to deploy it and make people use it. That's a top down push. Very hard, evangelical, long sales cycle. Bottoms up, you can study the existing workflow end users have. The average worker has like 7 apps they got to work across. Their day sucks because to pull a report, you got to go into this and then grab that and paste it in Excel. If you can collapse steps, remove number of apps you have to go into, that's called the workflow simplification strategy. That's where you can get the end user adopting it, and that's really good for bottoms up stuff. HipChat did a great job with that because they were integrated with Jira. So for developers, it was very natural to gravitate towards that, right? So that's sort of the bottoms up, take a shitty existing workflow and make it simpler, make life easier for worker strategy.
Cool. Great. Well, sadly, I think we're out of time. Thank you to you guys. Round of applause for our panelists. Thanks.